as Luis pointed out at the beginning, we really need to think very differently about how we're going to work in cities and metropolitan areas going forward. And our next panel is going to explore how we actually do that, how we take down some of those barriers, and what we're doing now to really reimagine different ways of working together to make metropolitan areas work well as equitable and prosperous, just cities. Okay, and so let me please introduce our panel. We'll bring them onto stage in a minute. Let me remember who they are. First, we have the Honorable John Hickenlooper, the Governor of Colorado and the former Mayor of Denver. Mary Sue Barrett from Chicago. Ben Hecht, Manuel Pastor, and our moderator, Andrea Bernstein. Please, the next panel, come on up to the stage.
Hello, everyone. This is the Not Just Cities portion of the Just City Day. This panel is breaking down the barriers. And I am really excited to be having this conversation because I'm going to press everybody to be data-based, fact-based, to speak candidly, to speak in plain language. I know that everybody here is an expert and everybody knows what maybe you learned about the BRT at the TRB, and maybe your DOT has created a TOD. But we're going to try to speak, in language that everybody understands, because, I certainly hope that this conversation will be one that will resonate far and wide and will be something that all kinds of people can talk about. So I'm just going to, jump right in. I think one of the things that we have here today is some examples of success of regions working together. So I'd like to talk about that. But first, I wanted to establish the sort of, or ask, what did the data tell us about whether that is really a good thing? Obviously, several decades ago, there was a feeling in this country that it was better for regions not to work together. And that was sort of the dominant ideology, that people would move out to the suburbs and those would be their own independent units, and that would be a more effective way of social organization than everyone working together. And in fact, all kinds of social structures were created. Colorado was one example where, in fact, you couldn't work together regionally. There were lots of barriers thrown up for that. So let's start with Professor Manuel Pastor of the University of Southern California, who has actually studied this issue, and you can start by giving us some examples of how it is that areas that work well regionally do better than other areas.
Well, you've asked us to speak clearly and simply, and the first person you turn to is an economist, so that might be a mistake. And
I'll help.
I want to both thank the Ford Foundation for bringing us together and then say one thing I'm a little mad about, which is that a friend of mine was going to use Teddy Cruz as an architect for her remodel, and I imagine he's much more expensive now as a result of this video. So there's been a tremendous amount of evidence that's been emerging over the last 10 to 20 years, taking a look at America's metropolitan regions and trying to see what the relationship is between social equity and economic performance. And I've contributed to some of the literature myself, but what you tend to find out is that those areas that have done a better job at deconcentrating poverty, those regions that have done a better job at shrinking distributional gaps, those regions that have done a better job at racial desegregation are actually growing more rapidly and sustainably over time. Now, I know that some of you may be looking at me, gosh, this must be some leftist professor from the University of Southern California. I used to be a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, a place that doesn't even have grades, right? And has as its mascot the banana slug, or as I used to like to think of it, the fighting banana slug. But so if you don't believe me, believe the Cleveland Federal Reserve, that did a study for Fund for Our Economic Future, the sort of business philanthropic group in Northeast Ohio trying to bring together regional coalitions. They looked at the factors that predict economic growth for mid-sized metro regions like Cleveland, 120 of them. They found the factors you would imagine: anchor universities, industrial diversity, et cetera. But perhaps to their surprise, they found that When you deconcentrate poverty, when you have less racial segregation, when you have less of a distributional gap, you tend to have more economic growth. More people are invested in human capital in those kind of situations. It reflects a more vibrant kind of economy, as Bruce was pointing to earlier, and it creates the conditions for the sort of consensus that you need to really move a region forward.
So give us two concrete examples. Give us an example of an area that has been successful, and sort of briefly why, and one that hasn't been successful. And I will give you the radio host admonition that you have 40 seconds for each.
It's never good to identify a loser. So let me start with, one region that's been remarkably, surprisingly successful is Jacksonville, Florida. It's a place you don't think of, but it's actually had pretty good sustainable performance relative to the South in terms of its economic growth and in terms of moving the needle on social equity. And I think actually one of the secrets in Jacksonville is the Jacksonville Community Council that brings together business, community, and labor to be able to kind of form an understanding of what's going on in that region and create a shared understanding of its problems and the need for high-quality jobs, et cetera. And when they have a shared understanding of the problems, then they may have some differences on what the solutions are, but they've been able to move forward in great ways. I think I'll leave the losers to others.
All right, maybe we'll get somebody to, before we're through, to say that. So Governor Hickenlooper, and did everybody know the governor used to brew beer? This is true. I first met the governor when I went to a town hall meeting convened by the White House Office of Urban Affairs in 2009 to talk about the Fast Tracks program in Denver. And one of the things that I did as sort of preparation for that discussion was to sort of find out how Fast Tracks, which, as many of you know, was a referendum. Well, it's a transit system, but there was a referendum to support it, a sales tax referendum, which passed in 2004, which I will remind people was when George W. Bush won the state of Colorado. And one of the things I wanted to look at was, how did Colorado get this? How did Colorado get people to say, yes, we want to raise our taxes, we want to put money in a transit system? And I just come off this discussion in New York about congestion charging, where people had said the opposite. We don't want to pay us drivers for their transit. And it was a completely different kind of discussion. So I wanted to sort of ask Governor Hickenlooper, who was then the mayor, what was the impetus for deciding that this was something that you had to do as a region? And what was the real sort of horse trading that went on when you went out to all those Republican counties, and there were a lot of them, and said, I need your help to do this?
Well, there were two things. One was the Metro Denver had a history of collaboration on a fairly large scale, dating back to the 80s, when all the wealthy families were moving to the suburbs, that first big migration, when it really hit full stride. The boards of the Art Museum, the Symphony, they all feared funding, and basically the boards all shared their mailing lists, and they passed a 1/10 of 1 cent sales tax for the whole metro region for cultural facilities. They call it the SCFD, the Scientific and Cultural Facilities District, which is much beloved, raises over $40 million a year now. That's why Denver has the 4th most visited zoo, 4th most visited Museum of Nature and Science. All this stuff came from that, and it created a foundation of some sense of collaboration. So when transit came along and the sprawl and the traffic jams got worse, we went out in 2003, right after I got elected, and we had that platform of collaboration, but we started trying to sell the suburbs, even the mayors where the light rail line wasn't going anywhere near their municipality. We pitched them that what the real beneficiary here was not the person who got in the light rail train and went to and from work. They gave up a certain amount of freedom. The person who was the real beneficiary was the person who drove their car to work, still had their freedom, but did it and saved 20 or 30 minutes a day in their commute time. And it worked out. We did a bunch of studies and could show that even if you had no light rail line close to your municipality, your residents traveled everywhere. And that they would, for I think it was about 28 cents a day, they would save 23 minutes on the average in their commute time. And basically you were paying someone to get out of your way, which is, no one said it quite that way. But this was kind of the beginning of this, and I think we're seeing this now on a larger level around the country, that collaboration is the new competition, and that even in business now, if you can find ways to collaborate, you're going to do better than when you're just ruthlessly competing.
And did you have to promise them anything else? I mean, were you able to just purely on the persuasiveness of the intellectual arguments able to get all these counties on board?
Well, in a few cases, I had to give them my undying love, or put them at the top of my most cherished persons list. Mostly, it was as the big city mayor, I was going out to the suburbs wherever I could and making sure that I wasn't the alpha dog, that they recognized that I didn't believe we could have a great city without great suburbs. And that I thought great suburbs would really add materially to the city doing well, but that also it was both ways, and that if we worked together, we made treaties, essentially, but my predecessors had been poaching each other's businesses. So the mayor of Denver would poach a business from Aurora. Denver's about 600,000 people, Aurora's 300,000 people. They would offer incentives, and just a lot of visceral, almost hatred. And within 6 months, when I got elected, the new mayor of Aurora, I'll tell you a very funny story, just briefly. The previous, and my predecessor, Mayor Webb, was a great mayor, one of the great American mayors, but he was old-fashioned, and the mayor of Aurora was a guy named Paul Tower. And I went and visited Paul Tower before I ran for mayor. And I said, is it really the issues or some of it personality? And he looked at me and he was very pugnacious. A wonderful mayor as well. And he went, no, your airplanes are keeping my citizens awake and you're poaching our businesses out there. I said, wait. If I was mayor of Denver and we had a press conference together and I made sure you got all the credit, all the ink in the newspapers, all the sound bites on TV, would that make a difference? He goes, it might. And so his son became the new mayor of Aurora. And within 6 months, we had a written agreement agreeing that we would never poach businesses from each other, that it wasn't adding. The same thing with cities poach businesses from each other, right? That's not helping the national growth or doing anything except, giving handouts to businesses and I think distracting them from what they should be doing, building their businesses. But anyway, we made that agreement not to do any poaching, and that became, again, part of the basis. Collaboration is like any muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. And we had a lot, just the cultural stuff, and then this kind of collaborative approach toward not poaching from each other. And part of it was as the big city mayor, I was the skinny kid with thick glasses and acne. And my dad, when I was little, told me if you can't talk your way out of a fight, you deserve to get whipped. And that kind of, when you're dealing with other mayors, sometimes that serves you well.
By the way, true story. One of Governor or then Mayor Hickenlooper's campaign advertisements was him in a shower, which you can find online.
That's a long story. It's not what she made it sound like.
It had to do with negative campaigning, and we'll just leave it to that. Now, Mary Sue Barrett, you're going to have to follow that with that image in everybody's mind. But the Metropolitan Planning Council worked with a number of businesses in Illinois to pass a subsidy for employers to help people buy affordable housing. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that campaign and organizing the campaign, because one of the things as I was reading about it that was a big question in my mind is, how did you get, I understand why employers want housing, but employers want a lot of things. They want extra lanes on highways, maybe. They want more parking spaces. They want great schools. So I'm wondering, how did you get them focused on that as an issue and then sort of move them to the place where they were going to become part of the lobby for that?
Self-interest. So this idea was inspired by Silicon Valley, and it was, a decade ago when we were in a very different economic climate. What's interesting to me is how adaptable this tool has been and what a conversation starter it has been for us to achieve multiple other goals. So literally it was one employer back in the year 2000. It was an ex-urban manufacturer of smoke detectors and fire alarms, 900 mostly Latino workers coming from 90 minutes away, oftentimes, and huge turnover, costs to the employer. So it was an innovative CEO, now my board chair, and this company said, well, I think we can save some money. Let me look at running some numbers. We adapted a tool that Carl Guardino's group had been involved with Silicon Valley Leadership Group, and it didn't quite make sense, their context to our context, so drew a boundary of 15 miles because that was, it's tight. It makes sense to be tighter in some locations, but this was an ex-urban area, and said an employee was had good standing and was within a certain wage earning scale, had an opportunity to get housing counseling up front and then a $5,000 down payment assistance. Altogether, by outsourcing that set of services, that employer spent $150,000 in the first year, counseled about 60, housed about 35 of those, went through the process into homes, mostly first-time home buyers. They recouped $150,000 and saved an additional $100,000 in 12 months. I challenge any of us to look at a benefit that an employer can offer that has that kind of return on investment. So from that, we were off to the races. We were able to get the state of Illinois to actually provide some matching funds, some tax credits for employers. Illinois is not.
Wait, don't gloss over that.
Well, it was a surprise, actually. This was under our former governor, you know, the one who was just convicted. Didn't care about housing, but you find your champions. So it was that return on investment argument again.
But why, I mean, you know, obviously the state of Illinois, I mean, wasn't facing the kind of crisis it is now.
Then, but it's been renewed two times.
At that time, their state still was having to spend some money. I mean, it was in the form of a tax credit, but that's still money.
It is. But to be able to show 4-to-1 leveraging of those dollars, again, there's very few economic development incentives. We're in the poaching game too often ourselves. This very modest investment of the counseling help and the tax credits, for every dollar the state of Illinois spends, they are able to leverage $4 of private investment. So what I want to share with you, though, is that this tool has become very adaptable. So obviously, we're in a very different economic climate, but this has been useful in a city context. We've used it for our Chicago Housing Authority Plan for Transformation to get employers to help anchor the market rate and the affordable component of those mixed income communities. We've used it in this down economy. Now, there are certain sectors that are quicker to adopt. Healthcare institutions, universities, manufacturers, they're tied to their place. They want to stay where they're at, and they need some help to do that. But our model is not just to help. It's great to help house these individuals and to stabilize communities, but we're getting those employers to stay with us and advocating for policy changes. And that's, I think, what shows some promise.
Was it just that you came to them with this idea for housing before they got involved in, you know, lobbying for something else? I mean, for example, a lot of chambers and commerces do talk about highway expansion. You know, we need another lane because of congestion, which sort of, you know, putting aside whether that works. I mean, that is something that people believe in and are willing to organize around. So I'm wondering, was it just because you came to them with this idea and they just grabbed it? Or was there something sort of really inherent in this housing idea that you think would be sort of, you know, could be replicated anywhere?
I don't think housing was the selling point. And in our region, we've got all the race and class tangles that are as bad in Chicago as any place else. And so affordable housing is not a good term. We've been using the term workforce housing just to kind of keep the conversation going. That's been the less charged of a term. But we can all be for helping workers be successful, communities be vibrant and successful, families succeed. And so to tie it to, for the employers, again, self-interest was this driving thing. So to tie it to reducing their bottom line expenditures was a starting point, why they stayed with us on accessing and securing some of these incentives and now working on other policy issues is, I think, as well self-interest. I mean, if we can work on business climate issues, it is good for them, but it's also good for their workers. It's good for their communities. If the communities in which they're located are functioning better, then they're going to be able to put more resources into things that are going to grow their business. We're taking this model and now expanding it to a menu of commute options. So employer-assisted housing would be one on the menu, but to help, we're just piloting it with about a dozen firms this year, but to allow an employer to kind of pick off the tree of different incentives that make sense for them. It might be van pooling or transit incentives or a biking incentives program, but all about helping reduce their expenditures and the employees' expenditure. We also give them some great public relations. I mean, really, when a company has done this, they tend to get a halo effect, which is nice too.
Ben Hecht, your organization, Living Cities, is working in a number of regions to sort of promote bringing people to the table. And one of the questions that you sent in is what is the secret sauce? By which I think you were referring to the special sauce in the McDonald's ad, which sort of special sauce seems sort of more accessible than secret sauce. So I'm wondering, in these two examples, Colorado, Illinois, what do you think was the special sauce? And, you know, sort of, I mean, that whole McDonald's business model is, you know, you can produce it in mass quantities.
Right.
So how could that happen?
First, I want a record to reflect I was not referring to
McDonald's at all. but I think it's a couple things. One of them, I think the phenomena that you see here is really that the political system is dragging far behind the reality and the way that people want to work. And so part of it, years ago in a prior life as a law professor, I taught state and local government law. And what you learn, governor, of course, is that the governor, the state, creates the locals. And the locals wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the state. And so what's happened over the years, going back to the beginning of the nation, is that the states created hundreds of locals because they made sense at the time. And today, they don't really make sense anymore. The idea that you need hundreds of school boards in a single state or thousands of, you know, little districts for individual problems. And so what's happened is, essentially, while that's really hard to change, because you have elected people for each of those individual things, the people are solving the problem their own ways. And so number one, I think what you have, and the governor talked about it, Manuel talked about it, is that they're essentially collaborating using whatever authority they have. And sometimes it's real authority, where you have visionary political leaders who have the political authority, but more often than not, it's apparent authority. People are going to use whatever political capital they have to come together to solve a problem. And usually the problem takes a really long time to fix. The fast tracks wasn't born overnight, not going to be done overnight, what they've done in Chicago. So the first thing is there's this kind of trend or momentum towards people coming together, what I think of as at a new table. And largely what it is, in my mind, is it's a new civic infrastructure, because in many ways our civic infrastructure, I think worldwide, collapsed. Some places it never existed, other places corruption sort of made it ineffective, but in many places people are coming together with their real and apparent authority from the public sector, from the private sector, nonprofits, bringing together all types of capital. And they're essentially saying, okay, we've got to solve our problem. And people know that, number one, they want people out of their way. Others want to get on a place and quickly get to the jobs. People know that the jobs are not going to be in their neighborhood where they live. They know they're going to be somewhere else. Common sense, people know the way things have to work. And so what we're trying to do is ride that momentum and try to go to those places that say, we have a critical mass of leaders who are going to come to this one table, and they're all going to bring what they have. And they're going to hold each other accountable over a long period of time. And they're going to set some goals. They're going to watch to see whether or not they're being met. They're going to adjust. They're going to say, how do we use all of the financial resources we have in place? And where possible, we're going to build new ones that are by definition regional. And so in California, for example, there's been a really remarkable fund that's been created, started through this Great Communities Collaborative. It's, God knows, hundreds of counties come together. You probably know, but really probably 20-some counties in the Bay Area who came together and said, this is a regional economic challenge we have to get people around. And so in the last few months, they've literally built a fund that will help people to buy and acquire land throughout that multi-county region to be able to make this thing work.
So, to continue with the table metaphor, what is the sauce that's being brought? I mean, is there a particular sort of, in each of these cases there was there obviously was a convergence of interests, but there were catalysts that sort of, everybody wanted the same thing, but everybody wants the same thing in a lot of places, and they don't get things like fast tracks or employer-assisted housing.
Well, I think it ultimately comes down to leadership. And so what?
On whose part?
On an array of people. So a governor, a political leader, a private sector leader. I strongly believe local philanthropy has to have a point of view about what the world needs to look like, where they are. Nonprofits, community folks, they need to come together, and it needs to be able to withstand a 4 or 8 year term of a mayor or a governor, or withstand the charismatic nonprofit that everyone loves no longer being there. And one of the models that has really convinced me that this can work came out of Cincinnati, and an initiative called Strive. And it really was led by civic leaders, and they looked at each other and they said, what's the biggest problem that our region faces? And what they said was, we're failing our kids. We're failing our kids from the day they're born to the day they're actually expected to leave the house, which if you have 20-year-olds like I do, they don't leave the house. But assuming they leave the house, and they fail all the way along the way.
Or you have a 30-year commitment.
Yeah. And so, and what they said was, you know what? We're all failing them. Our political leadership is failing them. Our corporate leadership is failing them. It was Procter & Gamble, Toyota. Our United Way is failing them, who funds all the preschool stuff. Our schools are failing them, from who's supposed to educate 0 to 5, who's supposed to educate P to 12, who's supposed to do community college and beyond. And so they all looked at each other and they said, we all suck. And they basically set a series of goals. And they said, this is where we are. This is where we want to go by when. And they collect the data, and the people who are good at collecting data, like University of Southern California and the like, they collect the data, they report it out, and every year they report it out. And the superintendent of schools are held accountable. The United Way, who funds the preschool programs, are held accountable. But it's basically this mutually reinforcing public way that the leaders are literally holding themselves accountable. Last thing, so one of the women who led it is now the head of the SUNY system, Nancy Zimpher. And Nancy is an extraordinary leader. And we supported this work, and we supported them looking to see if this model of this framework of one-table leadership could work. And my staff person came in and said, did you hear that Nancy's leaving Cincinnati? And I looked at her and I said, we're dead. You know, we invested in this charismatic leader. I know I believe in this one-table concept, but I don't know how much I believe it. And it's now been more than 2 years. The effort is stronger than it ever was. The other leaders who are at the table stepped up. And it's happening, and that's just one example, but it's happening all over the place. It's a very different type of leadership model. It's distributed power, but it's reality-based. It's based on the way the world works.
Did you want to jump in on that?
Well, I was eager to add 2 things. One was actually about kids, because I have a son who's a musician whose backup career is as an actor, and he did move back at one point. And after a month or so, I said to him, Joaquin, what part of empty nest do you not understand? You seem to have the nest part down. The empty part escaped you. But what I did want to say is that I think that these collaborations are very important, and that part of what they do is help build bridges across different gaps. I sometimes describe these as being kind of face-to-face, race-to-race, and place-to-place in ways that the conversation in Washington isn't at all, right? Where people really come face-to-face with the consequences of the decisions they're making and how they impact their neighbors and can help build a community or not. Now, I think part of the secret sauce in these as well is to understand that it's not just special sauce, is that it's not just one institution or one sector that will drive it, but one that we have not mentioned is social movement organizations. If you want to make sure that inclusion, fairness, and justice is part of the debate about how we form regions, then these social movement organizations that have risen up to deal with this stuff at a regional level, so the sort of groups that are under the Partnerships for Working Families, the labor-affiliated sort of think tanks moving a justice and economic development agenda in different metro areas. You have FRESC, for example, in Denver, which has helped keep Denver honest, right? Even as the business community is doing what it needs to do. You've got the Gamaliel organization, which has been organizing around these issues. You've got the Right to the City network that's been trying to deal with these issues of gentrification. So I think if we think about how to make sure we really have a just city, we need to think about democratic participation and social movements.
All right, so let's talk about problems with regionalism, because I've thought of a few bad examples just as we've started this panel. But we did a documentary earlier this year called Back of the Bus, which you can find at transportationnation.org/backofthebus. But one of the things we looked at was Oakland and the Oakland Airport Connector. And we actually didn't dive into this too deeply, but during our research, the example came up that you've got, this sort of set of regional interests making decisions about transit, and that when you have a set of regional interests making decisions about transit, the people who live in a city like Oakland are not, they're having to listen to what their grandfather wants at the table, and not really getting to say what they want. And as a result, you have a system where the bus service in Oakland is getting cut, and they almost didn't even get a stop on the airport connector that was going to go through Oakland. So, that's an example where you have a lot of regional interests, but then you have the most powerful interests sort of getting to dictate. So I'd like to maybe start with you, Mary Sue, and sort of how do you deal with that?
The panel just before us got into some great ideas about the equalizing force of technology. I also liked what I heard as a phrase in this video about scarcity being the platform through which innovative approaches happen. I really believe in both of those things. We work in a collaborative that's, I think, the best example of a number of cross-suburban collaboratives, but the biggest and the one that's starting to have some traction is in the south suburbs. I think that you do need organizations, kind of pushing you, and this is the part of our region that would have been screwed in the past by those regional decisions. They didn't get their fair share of fill in the blank. They're the one part of the region that doesn't have transit service, direct transit service serving most of the communities. So, 40-some communities within South Cook County banded together. They heard the lingo of the Obama administration, sustainable community, livability principles, sounds good. And they said, where's the rewards? And there were very few. So they came together and said, well, we're going to both influence our regional planning process, which was underway, but they always seem to be underway. So we've just completed a 2040 process that's really innovative. It wasn't the big downtown groups, committees deciding it. It was bottom up, a lot of community forums, a lot of technology, keypad polling tools. And so they got some of their priorities into that, but then, if that's the end game, then you're going to be waiting a long time. So they have designed a strategy and talked to leaders at the state, mostly state and federal levels, about rewards. So slowly, there's been some changes to some longstanding federal programs to actually reward communities that band together across these boundaries and go after dollars. We use this term interjurisdictional. I'd love someone to help me come up with a better term, but it is.
It's a bad term.
It's a bad term. But working across borders also makes you think like Mexico. I don't know what to call it. But obviously capacity is this huge, huge problem that in this scarcity moment that we're in, communities don't have the resources to apply for some of these if you're not Chicago, if you're not Denver. So given that, and that the way the world works is that the silos that the dollars come spewing out of isn't useful, the South Suburbs said, enough, we're not going to do it. So in the last year and a half, they have together secured $19 million of funding from DOE, HUD, all these different sources within a framework of a vision they call their green time zone. It's about cargo-oriented and transit-oriented investments. So when they get dollars, for example, for foreclosures, they don't just sprinkle it, they target it around a node or an economic development strategy. So I think that they feel that something has changed for them. In the past, it used to be dictated, and now they're in the driver's seat.
I mean, you won as governor, so clearly that was sort of a ratification of this regional approach on some level. But I'm wondering sort of if you have any sense about...
He had another shower ad, I think.
There was an ad on a horse, too. There was the sense of, like, what are the pitfalls? What is the sort of, this was it's now 2011, this was something that was in 2004. In those 7 years, what sort of unexpected consequences did you find from this regional approach that you might tell other mayors or governors, watch out for this?
Well, I think first, let me just say that I agree with the scarcity notion. And 2004 we were coming out of a recession there. I couldn't help but notice that I did the math, being a math whiz, well, maybe not quite, but 75 years for the Ford Foundation, that takes you back to pretty close to 1935, right? Time of pretty severe scarcity as well. And a lot of times people are more easily pushed there. And I think what we're all talking about is the alignment of self-interests at all kinds of levels. And one of the real pitfalls is the disconnect between federal funding processes and state versus local. Actually, I think I saw that the Secretary Donovan's going to be here later, but one of the great innovations that the Obama administration, I haven't seen them get credit for it, but for the first time in anybody's memory, the Secretary of Transportation meets with the Secretary of HUD, meets with the Secretary or the Administrator of the EPA every several weeks, every 3 or 4 weeks, so that if you're applying for $500 million for transportation, you better have affordable housing around your light rail stops. You better be doing brownfield redevelopment.
It's like the Green Cabinet or something, right?
But, I don't even think you have to go there. I think you have to say they're running government like a business. They're actually orchestrating their investments to get the maximum yield and benefit. You better have workforce training centers close to your light rail and have a plan that's integrated, which as a local official is breathtaking and allows us to really contemplate breaking down some of those potential pitfalls. Obviously, with fast tracks, inflation, commodity costs going up so fast, and then the recession. I mean, and we got fast tracks passed. I neglected my own punchline, but we had 32 out of 32 mayors, right? Every single mayor, large cities like Denver and Aurora, and small towns like Foxfire, Republicans and Democrats, all 32 mayors unanimously supported a 0.4% sales tax, right? Which is pretty much unheard of. And that, even with that collaborative effort, you can't control the economy. And so all of a sudden, sales tax revenues drop down, commodities were going up, and you're in this vice of how do you keep faith with the public? When you had all the true alignment of self-interest, how do you make sure you deliver on that? And it's just like a business or any government, or any organization. You roll up your sleeves and say, all right, how are we going to do it cheaper? How are we going to do it better? How do we take this scarcity and use it to be innovative and find new ways of getting it done?
And you're in the process of answering that now, right? I mean,
Exactly.
you're looking to go back to the voters in 2012 or ask for more money?
That has not been determined. They're looking now at what are some innovative ways that you can fund things like one of the light rail lines out to the airport. They did the 3P, kind of a partnership between private and public and federal monies, but having a private partner putting up a large chunk of the money as in exchange for them being able to help manage it. Those kinds of ideas we probably wouldn't have done if we hadn't been forced to by scarcity.
We are already at the moment of asking for Q&A, but I'm going to ask for the first question from Bruce Katz. Because the issue was raised of this sort of, you mentioned in your remarks about stealing from other localities was one of the big economic development strategies prior to the crash. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to ask any of the panelists about that, because I do think that is a still very big barrier to regional cooperation, is that people feel like they, have to get the things for their area first.
Okay, well, I was in the middle of a tweet. So you just, I know, as the governor knows, anyone who's on Twitter, you can only really do one thing at a time. So,
do you want to think about that?
No. I think the question is really for the governor, because we make the proposition, and I think Manuel really sort of backs it up, that those places that stop the poaching then have more resources to dedicate to strengthen their strengths in a unified and collective way. Why is this so hard to get across other metropolitan areas, particularly in the older parts of the country, Northeast, Midwest, which frankly are so fragmented? I mean, we've adopted the 13th century British model of government, in a lot of these places. So as you, from the mayor perspective and now at the gubernatorial perspective, why is it so difficult to translate this notion of metropolitan collaboration across the country in a more rapid and accelerated fashion? Now I'm going to tweet again.
And I think these guys could probably answer, as close as they could probably answer better than I think I look at it as an appetite that is almost irresistible for elected officials to have a large company and we have, we're talking to people as well as anyone else is, even though I recognize it's not healthy. Not only is it a waste of resources, it's a distraction to your businesses, it's a distraction to your government, and that focus is critically important. And I think it's a little bit, during the campaign I gained about 11 pounds, and I'm a skinny guy. I've never had to diet, and yet, as my wife would point out, a pot belly on a slender person is not appealing. And so for the first time in my life, I had to try and control my appetite and really watch what I ate. And and what I learned very rapidly is you're always hungry, right? And it is, my level of empathy has grown dramatically for others who are challenged by that. And I think there's that same thing of that constant hunger and appetite that if you poach a company, suddenly it's in the newspapers and you've done this big thing and everybody feels that it's massaged that sore spot. And it seems to be, we were able to do it we've gotten literally every major suburb that has a budget for economic development would do any poaching in Denver. They've signed treaties with Denver and with each other, so they're not poaching at all. I brought this up with the governors, the National Governors Association, saying, there are a few states that looked at me like I was crazy.
Yes.
No, we've got some big opportunities here. Talk to us in 3 years.
Manuel Pastor?
There's a notion that this idea of either collaborating or paying attention to these issues of inclusion is something that can really only be done in high growth regions, right? So that somehow it's the province of the Silicon Valley, or it's the province of the Bay Area, or Denver during its boom. We actually did a study for Brookings in which we took on that argument, and we did the econometric work, and it turns out that the growth damaging impacts of high poverty concentration, lack of collaboration, et cetera, are actually more severe in the weak market areas than they are in the other areas, right? So I don't know politically why it's getting out there, but sometimes we think evidence will make a difference. Sometimes it doesn't, right? And I think we then need to think about what's the framing, what's the story, how do we get people to...
Only if you live in a facts-based reality.
I know. There's this great new book called Uncommon Common Ground that David Mortimer handed to me and asked me to mention, which, of course, I was one of the co-authors of. It's about to be made into a major motion picture. In which I'll be portrayed by Antonio Banderas. But one of the things we say about the book, about the title, is that people tend to go for the lowest common denominator, either the lowest common denominator of division or the lowest common denominator of what's the minimum thing we can agree on. I think in order to really move things ahead, you have to go to the highest common ground. You have to get at the tough issues of who's going to pay for that transit. You have to get at these issues of the racial differences between cities and suburbs. You have to deal with the changing demography in terms of immigrants, et cetera. How do we push ourselves to that highest common ground? And that is the secret of collaboration, conversation, and a lot of that really is happening at the metropolitan level in our country.
I also think you have to
Think about what the mayor said, and we see in other places as well in the last panel, which is you have to have somebody who says, when I'm out of office, I still care what happens. And so, because one of it is, when you're in office, you have some immediate short-term victories, and you get the press. The other is, and I think, and Bruce and I both work with the mayors of St. Paul and Minneapolis, and those guys, Mayors Ryback and Coleman, they basically are saying, we have to work together because basically we're a powerhouse in the metro area, number one. Number two, we have to reinvent what's the next economy for our area. And they, like Bruce was saying, it's got to be clean. It's got to build on the fact they still have Fortune 500 companies, but it's got to re-energize the entrepreneurial culture of the place. But they're basically saying our definition of leadership is not just about the 4, 8, 12 years I'm in power, but how do I position my legacy is why I'm in power as much as wanting to get reelected. And that's critical.
All right, let's take some questions before I call on somebody else.
Oakland, the city of Oakland wanted to respond briefly.
And please stand so that the video can capture you.
I'm just going to quickly respond on the transportation issue, and I missed the introduction. So let me just say that in this country, we spend less than 18% of our federal dollars on public transportation. So to me, that's the real fight. Oakland wants the airport connector, actually. The majority of the city council, including I, supported that because we have an international airport. And for me, when I talk to Chinese investors, that airport connector is actually very critical. But that shouldn't be pitted against the fact that I need good public transportation. Oakland, ironically, used to have great electric cars before they were all destroyed in the 40s and the 50s. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have a question in the middle here. Please wait for the mic and stand and identify yourself when you speak.
Hi, I'm Miles Rappaport, and I'm the president of Demos. And I guess I want to do something that's been a little bit discomforting to me in the conversation is the question about the role for government, for the public sector itself. Ben, it's just sort of, you were describing almost like this alternative table because the governmental structures have failed, so a completely different one has to be put in place. And I know Governor Hickenlooper and Manuel, you both come from states where there are huge challenges to the government doing its role. You know, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights in Colorado has been a model for how to, you know, handcuff the government and make sure that it can't do its job so that other things are required to take place. And of course, California's governance problems are legendary.
We're number one, right?
We're number 2.
So I guess the point and the question is, isn't it important to, A, make the government function the way it should, and on the second hand, to really defend a more robust role for government rather than just sort of placing it to the side? It does seem to me that still the public sector is the place where the resources ought to be made available to do the transportation and do the kinds of things that you're all talking about, and we can't afford to let it aside or let it be undermined by things like Tabor or the Proposition 13 or 2.5 in Massachusetts or any of those things that have happened. What do we do? How do you deal with that?
Let's talk about that. Governor, you want to?
Well, I think part of what we're losing, or what we've lost, we certainly are losing, is the battle over public sentiment. And I think that that's a big challenge for all of us in public service, whether we're in nonprofits or in government. You know, Lincoln, he said, with public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. That is why those who mold public sentiment go deeper than those who enact statutes or pronounce decisions. And we haven't done sufficient work at articulating what is the role of government, why, and how did it evolve from our founding fathers. And that, you know, I mean, I think there are a dozen different arguments you can use out there. We've been trying to use one which I think is one of many different truths, but that our Declaration of Independence basically guarantees that in this country, almost unique in the world, guarantees equal opportunity to all citizens under the law, right? And you could almost squint your eyes and say the Constitution becomes an enabling document around that. Well, if that's true, that is the rationale behind public education, transportation, why every person deserves a chance to get to any job. A lot of what we've been talking about around racial equity and descends on everybody being able to get to every job. All those things kind of flow out of that kind of an argument, but you never hear anyone talking about some of those basic foundational arguments. It's all just about we need more taxes, or we need this, or we need that, and it becomes so adversarial. You know, you end up, it's like the attack ads. And we didn't get into attack ads, but there's a reason why General Motors doesn't do attack ads against Ford. Of course, no one would do anything against Ford, not in this context. But no one does, you know, Coke doesn't do attack ads against Pepsi because they do it back and forth to each other and they diminish the entire market. And yet politicians, in the end, resort to the attack ads because it is effective in a short-term benefit, and they figure afterwards they'll resolve their differences, which they never do. People are so bitter, and it keeps us from, again, articulating those fundamental arguments of what is government and why should we all be, you know, what is that group empathy that allows us all to invest in each other's good.
So do you feel that can turn? Because obviously that is where the debate is now. Huge amounts of money going into attack ads, you know, sort of basically attacking the fundamental, you know, government is bad, government is bad, government is bad. If people hear this 24/7, then why should we be surprised when they turn around and say government is bad? I'm wondering if you feel that this is sort of the low point of is this the trough, and is it going to get better, or?
Goodness sakes, I hope so. I mean, there is the alignment of self-interest. People will always follow what's successful. And I try to hold up all the time. We came out of that positive campaign. We didn't do a single negative ad. I won by 13 or 14 points. And we passed with a Republican House and a Democratic Senate, making some of the worst budget cuts in the history of Colorado. we passed our budget by 80% between the two houses, right? And I think that could never have happened without a positive campaign, without some of these more kind of basic arguments and kind of foundational arguments about government's role. And hopefully that'll get picked up in other places. We haven't seen any inclination of that yet, but I'm sure it's just a matter of time.
Hope springs eternal.
Yeah.
Mary Sue?
I don't know that any of us were suggesting an abdication of the role of government to define problems and to plot strategy, at least the path towards the strategy. But this alignment of self-interests that we've been talking about requires, especially the federal government, to set a platform that rewards different kinds of actions. The cross-agency collaboration you were talking about, Governor, is new, and it needs to spread further. There's a whole host of metropolitan areas, Chicago being one of them, where it's bi-state or tri-state. And just like I was talking about earlier with the municipalities, this being an unnatural act because it's not rewarded. If this is the way our economies function, well then the intermodal ports ought to be rewarded to work across and to provide rewards for non-poaching treaties. I mean, this is the kind of, you hear the innovation at the local level. Who's rewarding that? Who's encouraging that? That's what I want our government to do.
Andrew, can I say one thing?
I totally, Miles, completely agree with you. In fact, we spend a significant amount of resources trying to help the public sector do the public sector role. Not even necessarily lead, just do their role. And I think for too long, there has been a big workaround. And it's like, well, we'll nonprofit our way out of this problem, or we'll private sector our way out of this problem, or the government will solve the problem. And the reality is you need them all. And so we work with the Kennedy School, where we bring 30, 35 chiefs of staff of mayors and county executives together to basically, we push stuff at them. They pull us towards things. But more importantly, they work together because they have no networks to figure out how do we figure out what they did in Chicago or Denver. And the like. But the reality is that there's been such a negative, when you say that government is bad and we want less of it, that's what you get. And then when you say, well, why don't they spend our money well? Why can't they leverage the money we give them 3-to-1? It's because no one's there to do it. And so we really do believe that you have to actually build that public sector capacity back to where it can actually use the public sector dollars that are going to it in the smartest way.
I think to just add to that part of this too is kind of the narrative or the story that we tell ourselves about the role of government in our lives. And I've been talking recently, I kind of end a lot of talks by talking about my dad who passed away last year. He was 95 years old, which is pretty old. And he came to this country in the 1930s with papers that were imperfect. And when World War II came, he was actually in New York. He was given a choice between being deported or joining the U.S. Army. So he gave a penny to my cousin Carlitos, who flipped it. And the penny came up a particular way, and a generation later, he went to the war and came back safe. And a generation later, his son is a full professor at USC, which would be even better if I could get football tickets, but just the same. And what I like to say is that's an American story. It's a great story, it's an American story, and it's the wrong story. Because in the 1930s, my dad had no papers, but he had a union defending his rights. And when he came back from the war, there was a GI Bill, which meant that he could buy a house in an inner-ring suburb, La Puente, through the ability to finance it. And he was also able to go to LA Trade Tech. He had a 6th grade education. He was able to go from being a janitor to being an air conditioner repairman, and we went from being poor to being working class. And I went to decent public schools because we were investing in them as a society. And when it came time for me to go to college, which was not expected, there was affirmative action to take a chance on a kid like me who did not fit the typical profile. And that's the American story. It is a story of individuals and what they need to do to get ahead, but it's also a story of the public policies we put in place and actually the social movements that help put them in place as well. And I think if we can recraft the narrative so that people really begin to understand the important role of government at helping us realize our individual dreams. It's not standing in the way, it can empower us. It means we do have to have a more effective government, et cetera, but we do need to retell this narrative as well.
All right, I think. We have time for one more question, which I'm going to take from the back, if anybody has one. back here, please stand up and please identify yourself.
Thank you. I'm Jamie Studley from Public Advocates, and I thank you, Andrea, for featuring the Oakland Airport Connector on the show that you did. There are a couple of themes that come out of that connect up many things that we're talking about, and they go to the role of government and the role of low-income people in creating the vision for government. So one is just doing what we said we would already do, sticking with it and doing it right. We used the Airport Connector story to insist that the Department of Transportation enforce Title VI, and they are talking to all the other departments about enforcing Title VI, making sure that the opportunities for low-income people are included. So that's one way we can just do, as Mr. Rappaport said, let's do the things that we said we were going to do, even as we think about what else we can do. And the second piece of this is that we can help create the vision. It's not just a matter of participating or even being the decision makers, although those are both important. But to the extent that folks can create the vision for what government is going to do, it will sound more like what Professor Pastor just talked about. So we've put before the regional planners for the Bay Area the idea of equity, environment, and jobs-based scenarios for making big public investments. I'd love to hear, if you have time to answer it as a question, other places where you see that kind of energy to get out front of issues taking place in parallel ways. Thank you.
All right, let's quickly maybe get a response from each of you. Other areas where you see these kinds of things happening?
Well, I've got to say I'm enamored with my own Los Angeles. And I know that we haven't done as well on economic indicators, but what's interesting, I think, going on in LA is there's been a vibrant social justice movement, which is now really turning itself to the issues that Bruce was raising, which is not simply how you think about distribution after the economy has somehow generated growth, but how do you actually get in on the ground floor of the green economy by thinking about railcar manufacturing, for example, in Los Angeles, about retrofitting, et cetera. And so I see that a lot of the social movement organizations are really beginning to think about how to generate an economic development model that works. I find that very inspiring.
Mary Sue, did you want to?
I'm bullish about a particular opportunity in Chicago right now to look at bus rapid transit, but instead of the way we usually make infrastructure decisions, you know, kind of who asks, how long has it been on the list of projects, and does it just, it's only about moving people or dealing with congestion, a whole different set of questions and measurements, which is driven by what communities are asking for or are demanding. So it's about measuring access and diminishing food deserts. It's about access to educational institutions, about redevelopment potential and nodes. And so that kind of getting government to be responsive to what local communities and change agent organizations are asking for, that's the kind of institutionalization. And then I think, you know, potential for rewards if at any point we have an infrastructure bank or we have I don't think we'll have a T-bill anytime soon on the transportation side, but we might have some pilots for transformative investments. And I think the ones that are promising in many, many regions are the ones where we can measure and then talk about the multiple benefits to people. And I do think bus rapid transit is one that has potential in a lot of places.
Governor?
That's why people like Ray LaHood and Sean Donovan have been so successful, I think, in the administration. You know, I go back to a program we started several years ago in Denver. We call One Home, One Congregation, but we saw that there were roughly 1,100 congregations of various faiths and 1,400 homeless families. And we said, well, what would happen if you could get each congregation to adopt, not take into their homes, but raise a down payment and first month's rent for housing, and then put together 4, 5, or 6 mentors who would help this homeless family, usually a single parent, work their way out of homelessness. And you know, we had a prayer breakfast. We had about 400 people there and kind of planted the seed. And now we're at the point where we've had over 300 congregations. We've had over 2,600 individuals helped, over 2,100 volunteers. About 80% of the volunteers want to do it again, so they're involved and they're benefiting from it. And the likelihood of these homeless families staying in housing is almost double what it is by having these mentors who call a couple times a week and make sure that they are, you know, not slipping through the cracks, that their car hasn't broken down, that they've still got to get to work on time. That basic support of someone being interested in them as they're in this critical moment has been so powerful. And in the end, it wasn't just government. It's sort of what we were talking about. It was the faith-based community with a bunch of nonprofits working together to kind of help implement. Government was the convener and the catalyst. And I think those things, again, in times of scarcity, become powerful solutions.
Ben Hank, you get the last word.
Great. So I'd say the most promising in the near term, I think, is in the Twin Cities, where all the jurisdictions, it's not just Minneapolis and St. Paul, but they've come together with a real focus on using transportation as a way to equalize opportunity for people wherever they are in the region. I think that's kind of, we'll see short-term gains in that pretty soon. I think, and maybe this is a surprising vote, and I'll look at Mac and he'll laugh at me, but I think Detroit is the real laboratory. Where amidst chaos and scarcity will come some incredible things. And I think we'll see an amazing amount of not only diverse initiatives coming up, but they'll be very organic. I think in many ways they've learned how to deal with the fact that their government is not stable. They've learned to deal with the fact that they've had less and less money over 20, 25 years, and it's in its early stages, but it's created an environment that I think we're going to see what the future of America is going to look like.
All right, well, thanks very much to the Ford Foundation for convening this panel, and thanks to everyone. I learned a lot.